welcome back to the Blonde Informants. It's Karen.
And Mariah.
And we are back for a great episode. We actually have a guest joining us today, Mariah. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Yeah, so this is Carole, and she is the author of Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Messy, which is a great book to have right now. I'm sure we all can relate. She's a Christian. She's a wife. She's a speaker, a coach, and she hosts her own podcast.
And probably so much more. Carole Leathem, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you mind just giving us a little bit more information about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. So I have been married soon to be 48 years to my husband, and he was a pastor. And so from the time that we got married, I was a pastor's wife for, almost all of the first 40 years we were in ministry. And I loved ministry. I loved all of that. Raised our kids in the ministry. Both of our children are now in full-time ministry, as are their spouses.
Awesome.
So it's just kind of, ministry has always been in my blood. And we led a pretty charmed life. People were always joking about how, we went to Hawaii 40 times and all this time. But below the surface was bubbling this kind of like, chaos that I wasn't expecting, didn't see coming. And about 10 years ago, it started to manifest itself in my husband as anxiety. His blood pressure got out of control. We couldn't figure it out. His doctor finally said, I don't think you can keep working. You need to retire or you need to go on medication. I voted for medication. He voted for retirement.
Okay.
We weren't ready to retire.
Right.
And so we moved in with our daughter. And within a year, his anxiety had become depression. The depression had become suicidal ideation. And in November of 2016, our whole world just kind of crashed. He had to go into a psychiatric hospital. And I woke up one morning and my whole life had fallen apart. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But what I did know is that I had this foundation that I had been building since I had been 16 with God. So when you hit that kind of a wall, one of two things happens. You either blame God and walk away.
Right.
Or you lean into God and say, what the heck is going on? And I did the latter. I leaned into God. And God just began to show me that from the very first morning after I left him in the hospital, I got a plan. I got a job for you to do. And you're not going to be silent and you're not going to hide this.
Wow.
And so I just began to have these hard conversations about what mental health looks like, mental illness looks like. And a year ago, God challenged me to start a new ministry for caretakers. And I'm now launching the Caretaker's Journey. And it's a ministry with a podcast. And there's so much more coming in 2025. And I'm just honored that God has taken this broken, chaotic part of my life and finding something of value, if you say.
Beauty from ashes.
Yes.
Beauty from ashes. Absolutely.
Yeah,
love that.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you for sharing that testimony and that journey, because I think there's a lot of people out there that have been through things that are similar or in that space. I think that's something as Christians that I don't think people talk a lot about mental health and what we're struggling with. You know, a lot of us paint on a facade when we go to church and we're not being real. My day job, I work for Covenant Eyes. And so in my day job, we're talking about things like pornography and sexual addictions and things like that. And that's another one of those spaces, just like mental health challenges, where we don't want to talk about that in the church. And what advice do you have for people out there, specifically Christians that are listening? How do we change the culture of the church to where people can find safe places to find recovery? Because sometimes the church doesn't feel safe.
Oh, man. Well, the odd thing for me was that when everything first came down, I saw people walk away. I mean, we had been in ministry for so long in California where I live, and we're very well known. And it freaked a lot of people out because they were always asking me the same question. How could this happen? How could this happen? How could this happen? Because my husband had been a pastor, had been very successful in ministry. And I didn't have any answers about how this could happen at first.
Right.
But what I did see was people walking away because, one, they didn't know what to say, or two, it was too scary and too hard and too messy. I had people ask me the most horrific questions like, what's his secret sin? And I'm like, I would like get so upset because I'm like, no, 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 you don't understand.
You're missing
And
the
then
point
I
here.
Oh, yeah. And then the morning after I left my husband in a mental hospital, I had no idea where he was because in California we have something called the 5150, which is the welfare code. And it's if he's deemed a harm to himself or others, he basically goes to what I refer to as psychiatric jail.
Oh
And
my
so
gosh.
yeah. And so they had the night before, I'd gone with him because he'd made a call to a hotline and I don't know what he said. But they had asked me to bring him in. So I brought him. Well, first they were going to send the police. And I said, no, I'll
Yeah.
bring him. Just tell me. But it was like the most terrifying night of my life. And the next morning, I don't know where he is. I won't know for another 36 hours.
Oh, wow.
I have no say in what's happening to him.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, it was very terrifying. And when I sat there that next morning, I was like, who do I call?
Yeah.
I have no idea who to reach out to. So my advice, and so I just basically at that point wanted the hard conversations. And I'm not a person who shies away from hard conversations. And so I just began to kind of force open these doors. I kind of imagine it as, I was this ninja warrior just kicking in these doors saying, let's have these conversations.
Yes, we're having this.
And yeah, it's happening. It's
Yes.
real. And then one day, God asked me, I couldn't find help. That was the other thing is it's hard to find help. And if you're a listener who's out there looking for help and wondering where the help is, it's very hard to find it. I got fired from three counselors because they're like, I got nothing.
Really?
And they're like, I can't help you. I don't want to take your money. And so one day I wrote a book. And it basically, it's a very raw and transparent book. And it's very hard for some people to read. But I just decided that I was going to break open this door of
for you.
just,
And be the help.
we're going to have conversations.
Yeah.
And then it won an award.
Wow.
And God has just said, you are going to go and help these people. So
Good for you.
with the church, the most important thing that we can do is that we need to change the way we look at mental health. And mental illness is a brain disorder.
Right.
And it means that something in the brain is not firing. It doesn't mean that there's any sin. It doesn't mean that there's anything other than an illness of the brain. And because the brain is such a hard part of the organ of the body to deal with, we can't look inside and see what's wrong. And it's kind of a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Medication, psychiatry, how do we help? But if we could reprogram our brains to say this is a brain disorder in the same way that you have a heart problem, you have diabetes, you have to wear glasses. If we could change the way we look at it, I think it changes our compassion.
Yeah.
And that's my goal. That's my job. That's my goal. That's my calling. Let's change this.
That's so important.
Yeah.
So important.
And we talk a lot about health and wellness on our channel, and that's kind of a journey that me and my mom are on together. Have you seen any lifestyle changes really helped your husband through some of his recovery? And I'm just curious, has that been incorporated in his life at all through his recovery?
Well, the easy answer is no. The harder answer is when you're dealing with someone who is an adult, who is considered an individual, there's only so much as a caretaker you can do.
Yeah.
And so what I have done is I have made sure that I take care of me.
Right.
And I think when you're living with someone who struggles with mental health, it's easy to get sucked into this vortex of chaos.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to take a step back. Sometimes I have to walk out of the room. Sometimes we have to say, well, how am I going to take care of me? So what I did was I went back to the gym. I changed the way I ate.
Right.
I changed the way I got therapy. I actually went into therapy.
Yeah.
And I think that lifestyle changes are so critical, but we can't care more than the person
right.
that we're dealing with
Right.
and living with. And so we can only make suggestions. We can't force those changes.
Yeah.
And so,
But you could
unfortunately,
model
my
them,
husband
right?
is
And
now
it sounds like that's kind of what you do is model them.
Yeah.
Right?
absolutely.
That's
And so
excellent.
now my husband is struggling with some health issues because you cannot continue to put this much pressure on yourself
No.
Right.
without it
The
affecting your
body,
health.
Yeah. The body, just all of that trauma and that hurt and that pain. And yeah, that's a lot. Well, as a caregiver, I'm really intrigued by this because I've heard so many different caregivers express the emotional toll that really one takes on that. And oftentimes that's overlooked. I mean, if you can get over the hurdle of people like having the empathy and compassion for the struggler that's having issues with their mental health, oftentimes the
Yeah.
caregiver is kind of a second thought or afterthought. And talk to me about that. Like, how do we do better caring for one another in the church, especially when people are caregivers? Because there's a lot of them out there, that are just kind of secretly surviving in the
Yeah.
church, not getting the help and the support that they need.
So a year ago, I was kind of stuck. My book had come out. I didn't know what I was going to do next. And I started doing some research into caregiving because I had now added to my caregiving plate my mom, who lives in another state, not even a close state. She lives in Wisconsin. So I live in California. My mom lives in Wisconsin. And so I now added parenting and caring for my mom who had some terminal illnesses. So now I'm making trips to Wisconsin to help deal with her. And my sister lives there, but then there were some complications that I was having to go more often.
Yeah.
And what I started realizing is that caregiving is not for the faint of heart. And it's not something where you wake up one morning and go, I volunteer. I would like to be a caregiver.
Yeah.
It's something that we kind of wake up and find ourselves in. And when I started doing research, and this, you may not know this, but there are 55 million unpaid caregivers in the United States alone. These are people who care for a family member or a friend and are unpaid.
Wow. Yeah.
I did
And-
not know that.
And I can't remember what date. I don't have my statistics right in front of me, but another statistic is that just recently, within the last few years, caregivers burnout was put into the medical journals as a real illness that needs to be treated and considered
Oh, yeah.
serious when someone comes in to a doctor with certain symptoms. Because caregivers burnout is when we get so caught up in caring for our loved one that we forget to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that.
That is something that's real. Oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah.
So what steps do you take personally to kind of make sure that you are taking care of yourself as a caregiver? I mean, now caring for two different individuals and then on top of it, caring for your mom and you have grandchildren. I mean, so there's a lot packed into that. How do you care for yourself and make sure that you're making yourself strong and healthy and prepared for those tasks emotionally and physically?
Well, the first thing is I on my podcast, I talk a lot about taking a mini vacation.
Yeah.
And as a caregiver, sometimes we have to step away. Sometimes sometimes you only have 30 seconds. Sometimes you have a couple of minutes. But I talk about how it became so clear to me one day I was just having a really hard day. And I always get up in the morning, even though I go to the gym at 6, I get up between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. It's just the best time of the day for me. And I always start by going and making my favorite cup of coffee. And I talk on my website about how important it is to brew my coffee because it starts me into this relationship with God. Because I think that the two things that keep me going are staying in the Word, staying close to God, because I really do see Him show up all the time in my life. Sustaining me, taking care of me, walking in front of me. I mean, I have so many stories of how God has met a need before the need was even there.
Wow.
And taking that moment. So for me, it starts with a cup of coffee and sitting and being in the Word. Sometimes I can't read more than 4 or 5 scriptures because my brain is so tired. And I think we get inundated sometimes as caregivers thinking we have to sit down and read a whole scripture. Read a whole chapter or whatever. But sometimes it's just sitting there and reading one verse or reading 5 verses and just kind of centering yourself and then taking a mini vacation. And so this particular day, I was in my dining room with a favorite cup of coffee. And I have a beautiful photo painting in my dining room that hangs on the wall that was a gift from my friend's husband after she passed away. They had purchased it when we were on a trip to Hawaii together. And after she passed away, he asked me if I would like the painting. And so every time I walk by the painting, I would think of her when I first got it. But you know how it is when you have something in your house for a while, you kind of forget it's there. And so this particular day, I was having a bad day. I walked by the painting and I looked up, and it's a picture of a cabin in the mountains of Hawaii, by a waterfall. And I said to myself, boy, I wish I could be there right now. And then all of a sudden I thought, well, so I turned on some ocean noise in my phone, and I sat there with my coffee, and I just kind of stared at the photo for a few minutes and just did some deep breathing. And the next thing you know, I found myself going, oh, you could just feel this. Even right now, as I'm talking about it, I can feel the pressure leaving my system. So one day I was really having a bad day, and I walked into my kitchen. I had a cup of my favorite coffee in my hand, and I was just kind of at my wit's end, and I turned over and saw this painting. And it's a beautiful cabin on the side of a hill in front of a waterfall, and it's my beautiful favorite colors, purple, pink. And I just said, oh, I wish I could be there. I wish I could be on that porch right now. There's a rocking chair, sitting on that porch drinking my coffee. And I realized I had a cup of coffee in my hand, and I thought, well, why can't I just take a little mini vacation? So I turned the sound of waves on in my phone, and I stood there and stared at the picture for about a few seconds. And pretty soon I just started to feel, even talking about it, I can feel the pressure just starting to let down. And after I walked away, I thought, sometimes our attitudes are the things that need to change. And so for me, it's always being aware of the stress. If I'm starting to feel the stress bubble up, then I have to stop and say, what do I need to change? What am I thinking? Sometimes it's the narrative in my mind, the things we say to ourselves. And we have to change those narratives, because if we're going down this road of, I didn't sign up for this, the Holy Spirit says, oh yeah, you did. And I know when those words start hitting my brain that my focus is on the problem and not on God. And when we start focusing on the problem, then we either try to control it or we let it overwhelm us. And it's so, so important that we ebb and flow with the situation, especially when you're dealing with mental illness.
I love the self-awareness too. I feel like that's a skill most people don't really have, unless they learn to kind of acquire it over time and through experiences. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I like that too. Well, you've shared with us kind of your journey and, the story of your husband, being a pastor and going through that. And do you think, oftentimes, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I know certainly, even for myself, and I would imagine for a pastor, for someone in a position like that who takes great care and shepherds his flock, when he retired, do you think that that identity that he had in, being the pastor, being the shepherd, caring for his flock, and then all of a sudden things changed, it was kind of forced on him because his health was you got to make a choice here. Do you think that had any impact in kind of leading him to a bubbling point? And do you think there's any lessons for the rest of us to be wary and watchful of, putting our identity maybe in the things that we do versus in the Lord? Or not that he didn't do, of course he was serving the Lord, but you know what I mean?
I think over the last 10 years, it's okay for it's all different. And that's one of the things I've discovered. The reason that the help is so hard to find is that every circumstance is different. And so what I've discovered with my husband, and that's what I can speak to, and that's what I kind of address in my book, is his was control. And over the last 10 years that we've been dealing with this, I can go back to an experience when he was 4 years old that he will tell me about, where his parents began training him to be in control of the world. And if you tell yourself something, then it makes it so. And so what I've discovered is there were moments along the way in our marriage where I would go, ooh, what is that? Well, now I look back and I go, oh, now I know what that was. So I think that not that I could have prevented it, but part of me wishes I could go back to that younger man and go, wait a minute, let's take a break here because I know so much more now. I think it goes back to what we were talking about, the self-awareness and being aware of the loved one's circumstance. So I can see where control was really the driving thing for him. And when he was in the church, there were things that he always felt were necessary. And so as a pastor, he always went into these churches that had problems, big, huge problems that he could solve and that he could help. And there was still an element of control. And so when he retired, the thing that was so frustrating is that he wasn't even retired 2 weeks and he took an interim position that was 10 times worse than anything we'd ever been in. And he jumped, you talk about jumping from the frying pan into the fire. He jumped right into the fire. And I really think that's what pushed him over the edge. And then the retirement has been really sort of a beautiful thing to watch because now we're in a church with our daughter and son-in-law who are on staff, not in a senior role, but on staff in certain roles. And the choir director here, she's a woman who just adores my husband and has kind of taken him under her wing. And so he helps her. We call him the general of the choir. And so it's just a beautiful thing to see him go and sing because he does have a beautiful voice. So he's getting to use his ministry in a different way, his gifting in a different way. So I think, though, to answer your question, there are times where the identity is so wrapped up that retirement does force you into maybe a position of confusion because now who are you? That happened to me. Because I woke up one day and I'm now a pastor's wife learning how to minister on the other side of the pew. And what does that look like? And so for me, I really went through an identity crisis. And so I totally see it, kind of both ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, thank you for sharing that because you're right. It is such an individual journey and everybody experiences things differently. And, it kind of all goes back to, our families of origin, a lot of who we are today and the hurts and the hangups and the things that we have, those come from those things. But understanding that and learning that, we have triggers and we have trauma and we have things that have happened to us and being able to point to those things and then work through them sooner sometimes is the best path. But we're often so busy and we don't pay attention to the little things, right?
Yeah.
Well, talk to us a little bit about your book. So you wrote this book as probably a way to encourage people out there. I can imagine that this is a book that's pretty much for anybody, but talk to us a little bit about the book that you wrote and how people can get their hands on the book.
So I woke up one morning. I have a friend who had kind of walked through the first few years with me. We'd been friends for a long time. And she would fly into Los Angeles and rent a car and drive over the hill every 10 weeks during the chaos, the first start of it, just so she could put eyes on me, as she would say. And I would just tell her, yeah, good friend. And I would tell her, I just can't find help. I don't know how to do it. And then slowly our conversations changed to I was developing processes that would help me. And one day, about 3 years into the journey, she said, will you stop saying you can't find help? And will you write a book? And so I walked away from everything, shut down social media and everything for about a month. And I went to my favorite place up in the Northern California area and sat in a chair in a sunroom. And I just started writing. And I never intended to publish it. It was kind of cathartic healing for me to just kind of get it on paper. And when I got done, through several circumstances, I got it edited, this beautiful cover, and then I self-published it. And then a friend of mine said, you need to enter it in this contest. And so I did. And then it won. And I won an award. And what I discovered is that what I intended to be cathartic healing, God intended to be a way for people to understand, number one, they're not alone. And number two, that there are things that we can do along the way. But number three, the relationship with Him is really pivotal. And so it's my foundation, and out of that foundation. So the book is very raw. It's very transparent. And yet it gives you hope that there are things you can do when life gets chaotic and messy. And can you have joy? Absolutely. Because your joy is not in the circumstances of life. Your joy is in the relationship with him. And so even on the hardest days, when I'm laying on this floor in my office crying, I can still find joy because I know that I'm not alone. And I know that I'm going to get through that hard day. So the book is available everywhere books are sold. I have a website called carolesjourney.com. Then I launched a new website called thecaretakersjourney.com. And so, oh, thank you. I designed it myself. So the caretakersjourney.com is the new focus and the new ministry. And you can find out how to get in touch with me there. My social media is at Carole's Journey or at the Caretaker's Journey. You can reach me both ways. And I love to interact with people who are caretakers.
That's awesome. Well, we'll be sure to put all the links to your social media, your websites. I think there's going to be a lot of people out there that can certainly relate, either as a caretaker or maybe someone that might be moving into that season someday in the future and they don't even know it yet. So I think it's good for us to prepare. I know my mother spent many, many years as a caretaker, and just watching from afar and watching her go through that process. Yeah. It definitely taught me a lot and prepared me that if, the day comes, maybe these are some things that I learned from this and things I want to do and don't want to do, because it took a huge toll on my mother, but she leaned into the Lord during that time. And I think that is so pivotal. In closing today, Carole, do you have any final words of wisdom or hope that you can share with our listeners just to kind of close that episode in a joyful way so that they have some hope?
The most beautiful thing that I have learned is that we can't isolate. And I think as a caretaker, that's one of the most dangerous things that we can do, because I'm a natural isolator anyway. And when I get into a hard situation with my caretaking, I tend to just want to, what I call, crawl into the bed of life and pull the covers over my head and just kind of ignore everything. And I think that there are 3 things that we need to do, and I would leave these 3 things with your listeners. The first thing is we need to understand that we have to take care of ourselves, or we can't take care of anybody else. The second thing is this is a cycle, and there are 3 kinds of people in the world: the people who have been caretakers, the people who are currently caretakers. So you haven't been a caretaker yet, but you're going to be in the future. You're already a caretaker, or you were a caretaker. And the statistics show us that it's like 90-something% of the people in the world will become a caretaker at some point. And so there's things that you can do. If you're not a caretaker right now, encourage a caretaker, encourage somebody, create a foundation of people. The people that I have in my life, some of them have been there for 20 years. Some of them are brand new, but you have to have the people. So don't isolate, and then get that circle of people to just encourage you and be there. And then don't isolate and run away from them.
Absolutely.
That is great advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining us for this short conversation, but super profound, Carole. Oh my gosh, you are going to be such a blessing to so many people out there with your work.
Thank you.
Sometimes our hurt and our pain and our testimony really can help transform other people's lives, because God uses all of that for his glory. So thank you so much for all that you're doing out there and being vulnerable and sharing your story so that others can find hope and healing. We appreciate it.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Blonde Informants podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast, and make sure you share this with someone in your life that might be either a caregiver now, or was in the past, or maybe in the future will be. This is really going to help them to get tapped into Carole's book and to her website and to her resources. So thanks for everybody tuning in today. We'll talk to you next time on the Blonde Informants podcast. Thanks so much.